James Sterling stood at the window of his penthouse office, watching the Manhattan skyline fade into dusk. At 53, he had everything money could buy except peace. The silence in his home had become deafening since Catherine's death 3 years ago, and now his family wouldn't stop reminding him of it. "You can't keep living like this, James." His sister Margaret's words from earlier that morning echoed in his mind. She had stormed into his office, determination etched on her face. "The company needs stability. The board is questioning your focus. You need a wife." James ran his fingers through his salt and pepper hair, his reflection in the window showing the weariness he felt in his bones. The Sterling Group, their family's investment firm, had been his life's work. But lately, even the thrill of closing multimillion-dollar deals felt hollow. "I have someone in mind," Margaret had continued, pulling out a photograph. Sarah Mitchell, 28, recently widowed. Her husband was Peter Mitchell, one of our junior associates who died in that car accident 6 months ago. James had studied the photograph. The woman was beautiful, with warm brown eyes and an elegant grace about her. But it was the sadness behind her smile that caught his attention. He recognized it all too well. "She's struggling, James. Peter left her with nothing but debts. She's too proud to accept charity, but a marriage. It would help both of you. The board would see it as a gesture of loyalty to our employees' families, and you wouldn't be alone anymore." Now, as the city lights began to twinkle in the gathering darkness, James loosened his tie and poured himself a scotch. The whole idea was absurd. He was too old, too set in his ways. And yet, set up a meeting, he had told Margaret finally. But no promises. The next evening found him at Le Bernardin, waiting for Sarah Mitchell. He'd chosen the restaurant carefully, exclusive enough to ensure privacy, but not so ostentatious as to be intimidating. When she walked in, James felt his breath catch. The photograph hadn't done her justice. Sarah moved with quiet confidence, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the flashy outfits worn by the other diners. As she approached his table, James stood, noting how she carried herself with dignity despite the obvious weight of her circumstances. "Mr. Sterling," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, her gaze direct. "Thank you for meeting with me." "Please call me James," he replied, helping her into her seat. "I appreciate you coming." The waiter appeared with menus, and James watched as Sarah studied hers with careful attention to the prices. It was a subtle thing, but he recognized the gesture of someone unused to such luxury. "I imagine you know why I asked to meet," James began after they'd ordered. "Your sister was quite clear," Sarah replied, a hint of steel in her voice. "You need a wife for appearances and I need financial security. A business arrangement, nothing more." James felt a spark of respect at her directness. "Essentially, yes, though I'd hope we could at least be friends." "Mr. Sterling James," Sarah leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting his. "I loved my husband deeply. I'm not looking to replace him, and I assume you feel the same about your late wife. But I also understand reality. Peter left me with massive medical debts from his final months, and I'm about to lose our home. If this arrangement can help us both, I'm willing to consider it." Her honesty was refreshing. No pretense, no manipulation, just stark truth. "The terms would be generous," James said, outlining his proposal. "All your debts cleared, a substantial monthly allowance, and a trust in your name. After 5 years, if either of us wishes to end the marriage, you'll be well provided for." Sarah listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. "And what would you expect from me?" "Companionship at social events. A united front for the company. Discretion, of course. Beyond that," James shrugged, "we each maintain our privacy. Separate bedrooms, separate lives. We'd be partners in presentation only." The waiter returned with their appetizers, and they ate in contemplative silence for a few moments. James found himself studying Sarah when she wasn't looking. There was something compelling about her, a quiet strength that reminded him of Catherine. "I have conditions," Sarah said finally, setting down her fork. I want to continue my work at the literacy center. It's volunteer work, but it matters to me. I won't be a trophy wife who just shops and lunches. James nodded. Of course. And I want honesty between us, she continued. No games, no hidden agendas. If there are problems, we discuss them like adults. Agreed. James felt a growing respect for this young woman who, despite her desperate circumstances, refused to compromise her principles. Then I accept, Sarah said quietly. But I want you to understand something, James. I may need your money, but I don't need you to save me. I'm not broken, just bent. Don't make the mistake of thinking you're rescuing me. James raised his glass in acknowledgement, a small smile tugging at his lips. I wouldn't dream of it. They spent the rest of dinner discussing practical matters, when they would marry, soon, where they would live, his penthouse had plenty of room, how they would handle public appearances. But beneath the business-like conversation, James felt something shifting in his carefully ordered world. The wedding was a small, private affair at City Hall, followed by a reception at James's penthouse for close family and key business associates. Sarah wore a simple cream-colored suit that made her look both elegant and understated. James found himself watching her as she navigated the crowd with grace, charming his business partners and handling probing questions with diplomatic ease. She'll do well, Margaret murmured, appearing at his side with a satisfied smile. The board is already impressed. James nodded, but his attention was on Sarah as she spoke with one of his oldest friends, her genuine laugh carrying across the room. She caught his eye and gave him a small, conspiratorial smile, a private acknowledgement of their shared secret. Later that night, after the guests had gone, James showed Sarah to her suite of rooms. I hope you'll be comfortable here, he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. If you need anything, I'll be fine, Sarah assured him, then hesitated. James, thank you, not just for the financial help but for being straightforward about all this. It means a lot, he nodded, fighting an unexpected urge to reach out to her. Good night, Sarah. As he walked to his own bedroom, James couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to become far more complicated than he'd anticipated. He'd gone into this arrangement expecting a simple business transaction. But Sarah Mitchell, now Sarah Sterling, was proving to be anything but simple. And as he lay in bed that night, listening to the distant sounds of the city, James wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake or the best decision of his life. Either way, there was no turning back now. The first months of their marriage settled into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. James and Sarah operated like well-choreographed dancers, moving around each other with careful precision, never quite touching but always aware of each other's presence. During the day, they lived separate lives, James at Sterling Group, Sarah dividing her time between the literacy center and various charity functions that came with being Mrs. Sterling. But it was during their evenings that things began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first. Started with dinner. Though they'd never discussed it, they found themselves gravitating to the dining room at the same time each evening. Sarah, who James discovered was an accomplished cook, often prepared meals that reminded him of his childhood in New England. My mother taught me, she explained one evening, serving a perfectly prepared pot roast. She believed every problem could be solved over a good meal. James found himself looking forward to these quiet dinners, where conversation flowed more easily than it did in the outside world. Sarah was intelligent and well-read, with opinions on everything from current events to classic literature. She challenged his views without being confrontational, making him think about things in ways he hadn't before. One evening, as they sat in the living room after dinner, James with his customary scotch, Sarah with her tea, she asked about Catherine. Tell me about her, she said softly. If you want to, that is. I see her picture in your study, but I'd like to know who she was. James stared into his glass for a long moment. He'd expected to feel the usual sharp pain at the mention of Catherine's name, but instead found a gentle melancholy that allowed him to speak. She was extraordinary, he began. Brilliant at business, she helped build Sterling Group into what it is today. But more than that, she had this way of seeing through people's facades. She could spot a dishonest deal or a genuine person within minutes of meeting them. Sarah listened attentively as James spoke about Catherine's passion for art, her terrible cooking attempts, her infectious laugh. As he talked, he realized it was the first time he'd spoken about Catherine to anyone since her death, without feeling like he was reopening a wound. "She sounds wonderful," Sarah said when he finished. "I wish I could have known her." "What about Peter?" James asked gently. "Tell me about him." Sarah's eyes grew distant, but like James, she seemed to find comfort in sharing memories. "He was kind," she said. "So kind it sometimes got him into trouble. He believed the best in everyone, even when they didn't deserve it. That's actually how we met. He was trying to help someone who was clearly scamming him, and I stepped in to stop it." As weeks turned into months, these evening conversations became something both looked forward to. They shared stories of their pasts, their hopes, their fears. James found himself opening up about the pressure of running Sterling Group, the weight of family expectations. Sarah spoke about her struggles after Peter's death, her determination to make something meaningful of her life. But it wasn't all serious conversation. Sarah had a quick wit that often caught James off guard, making him laugh more than he had in years. She brought a lightness to the penthouse that had been missing for so long. The change in James didn't go unnoticed at work. His executive assistant, Helen, who had worked for him for 20 years, commented on it one day. "You seem different lately, sir," she said as she brought in his afternoon coffee. "More present." James knew what she meant. He found himself more engaged in meetings, more patient with junior associates, more willing to consider new ideas. The fog of grief that had surrounded him for so long was finally beginning to lift. But with this awakening came complications he hadn't anticipated. He caught himself watching Sarah more often, noticing little things. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, how her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled genuinely, the graceful way she moved through a room. These observations made him uncomfortable, reminding him that this was supposed to be a business arrangement, nothing more. The situation came to a head during a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Sarah wore a midnight blue gown that made her look like she'd stepped out of a classic Hollywood film. As they moved through the crowd, James found himself hyper-aware of her hand on his arm, the subtle scent of her perfume, the warmth of her presence beside him. "Sterling," called out Victor Chun, one of their biggest investors, approaching with his wife. "And Sarah, you look absolutely stunning tonight." "Thank you, Victor," Sarah replied with her usual grace. "How's Emily doing at Stanford?" As Sarah and Mrs. Chun discussed their daughter's college experience, Victor pulled James aside. "You know, Sterling, I had my doubts when you remarried so quickly," Victor said quietly. "Thought it might be some midlife crisis. But I have to admit Sarah's been good for you. And good for Sterling Group, too. Our clients love her." James nodded, his eyes drawn back to Sarah as she laughed at something Mrs. Chun said. The sound made something twist in his chest. Later that night, as they rode the elevator up to their penthouse, Sarah leaned against the wall, slipping off her heels with a sigh of relief. "These events are exhausting," she said, rubbing her feet. "How do you do this several times a week?" "Years of practice," James replied, trying not to stare at the elegant line of her neck as she tilted her head back. "You're a natural at it, though." Sarah gave him a tired smile. "I'm learning. Your world is complicated, but interesting." The elevator doors opened, and Sarah stumbled slightly as she tried to walk in her stocking feet. Without thinking, James reached out to steady her, his hand catching her elbow. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, and he quickly let go. "I should get some sleep," Sarah said, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "Good night, James." He watched her walk away, his hand still tingling where it had touched her arm. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't supposed to happen. That night, James lay awake for hours, his thoughts in turmoil. He had married Sarah to satisfy his family and secure the company's future. It was supposed to be a simple arrangement, but nothing about his feelings for Sarah felt simple anymore. The next morning, James left for work earlier than usual, avoiding their usual shared breakfast. He spent the day buried in meetings and paperwork, trying to ignore the growing realization that he was developing feelings for his wife of convenience. But as he sat in his office late that evening, staring at reports he wasn't really reading, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Made your favorite pot roast. Don't work too late." James stared at the message, feeling something shift inside him. The simple domesticity of it, the quiet care it represented, made his carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. He was falling for Sarah Mitchell, and he had no idea what to do about it. The autumn chill had settled over Manhattan when the first real test of James and Sarah's relationship arrived. It came in the form of Richard Preston, a senior board member at Sterling Group who had never approved of James's marriage to Sarah. James was reviewing quarterly reports in his office when Helen buzzed through. "Mr. Preston is here to see you, sir. He says it's urgent." Richard stormed in before James could respond, clutching a tablet. "Have you seen this?" he demanded, his face flushed with anger. James looked at the screen Richard thrust in front of him. It was a gossip website featuring photos of Sarah having lunch with a young man. They were sitting close together at a small cafe, Sarah's hand resting on the man's arm, their expressions intimate. "She's making a fool of you, James," Richard said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "We all knew this would happen. A young, attractive woman marrying a man twice her age? She's obviously after your money, and now she's not even being discreet about her other interests." James felt his chest tighten, but kept his expression neutral. "Is there a point to this, Richard? The point is that your marriage is becoming a liability. The board is concerned about potential scandal. If she's seeing other men—" "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," James cut him off coldly. "Now, unless you have actual business to discuss, I have work to do." After Richard left, James sat staring at the photos. He trusted Sarah. Their relationship had grown into something far more meaningful than their initial arrangement. But seeing those images stirred something dark and painful in his chest. That evening, he arrived home later than usual, his mind still churning. He found Sarah in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. "You're late," she said without looking up. "I was starting to worry." James placed the tablet on the counter. "Care to explain?" Sarah glanced at the photos, then returned to her chopping. "That's Daniel Mitchell, Peter's younger brother. He's having a hard time dealing with some family issues. I was trying to help by holding his hand in public." The words came out sharper than he intended. Sarah set down the knife, finally turning to face him. "Are you jealous, James?" "I'm concerned about appearances." "The board—" "Don't," Sarah interrupted. "Don't hide behind the board. If you have questions about my loyalty, ask them directly." The tension in the kitchen was palpable. James ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the right words. "Sarah, Daniel came to me because he just found out his wife is cheating on him," Sarah said quietly. "He needed someone to talk to who understands loss. That's all. I would never betray you, James. Not just because of our arrangement, but because—" She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "Because you've become important to me. More important than I expected." The admission hung in the air between them. James felt something inside him crack, the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I should have trusted you." Sarah nodded, but the hurt was still visible in her eyes. "I'm going to stay with Margaret tonight. I think we both need some space to think." After she left, James wandered through the suddenly empty penthouse, feeling more alone than he had in months. He ended up in his study, staring at Catherine's photograph. "What am I doing, Katie?" he whispered. "I'm falling in love again, and I'm terrified." The next few days were tense. Sarah returned home but maintained a careful distance. Their easy companionship was replaced by polite formality that felt worse than outright anger. The situation reached a breaking point a week later during a crucial board meeting. James was presenting their quarterly strategy when Richard Preston interrupted. "Before we continue," Richard said, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. The stability of Sterling Group is intrinsically linked to its leadership, and recent events have raised concerns about Mr. Sterling's judgment. James felt his jaw clench. My personal life is not up for discussion, Richard. It is when it affects shareholder confidence. Your marriage to Sarah Mitchell was questionable enough, but now, that's enough. The voice that cut through the boardroom was firm and clear. Sarah stood in the doorway, her expression calm but her eyes blazing. Mrs. Sterling, Richard stammered. This is a private meeting. Yes, it is, Sarah agreed, walking into the room. A meeting about business strategy, not about my marriage. She turned to address the entire board. I understand your concerns. I'm young. I came from a modest background, and my marriage to James seems unconventional. But let me be very clear. I love this man. James felt his heart stop. Sarah continued, her voice steady. I didn't expect to fall in love with him. Our marriage began as an arrangement, yes. But James Sterling is the most honorable man I've ever known. He's brilliant at business because he sees beyond the surface, beyond the obvious profit margins to the human element that makes companies truly successful. That's why Sterling Group has thrived under his leadership. She looked directly at Richard. If you're questioning his judgment, perhaps you should look at the company's performance since our marriage. Profits are up 15%. Employee satisfaction has improved. Our charitable initiatives have generated more positive press than ever before. So please, by all means, discuss business strategy. But leave our marriage out of it. The silence in the boardroom was deafening. James couldn't take his eyes off Sarah, his heart pounding in his chest. Richard cleared his throat. I apologize if I overstepped. Apology accepted, Sarah said graciously. Now, I believe my husband was in the middle of a presentation. She turned to leave, but James caught her hand. In that moment, he didn't care about the board members watching. He pulled her close and kissed her, pouring all his unsaid feelings into that one gesture. When they finally broke apart, Sarah's eyes were wide with surprise. James, I love you too, he said softly, and I'm done pretending otherwise. Richard Preston coughed uncomfortably. Perhaps we should reschedule this meeting? James didn't take his eyes off Sarah. Yes, I think that would be best. Helen will be in touch with new dates. As the board members filed out, James and Sarah remained standing close together, their hands still linked. Did you mean it? James asked quietly. About loving me? Sarah reached up to touch his face. Every word. I've been fighting it for months, telling myself it was just gratitude or friendship. But it's more than that. So much more. The weeks following their declaration of love in the boardroom brought changes to James and Sarah's relationship that neither had anticipated. The careful dance they'd maintained for months gave way to a deeper intimacy, both emotional and physical. Yet with this newfound closeness came unexpected challenges, as the ghosts of their past relationships refused to stay buried. One rainy Sunday morning, as they lay tangled in the sheets of what was now their shared bedroom, Sarah traced the lines of James's face with gentle fingers. Tell me something you've never told anyone else, she whispered. James caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. The night before Catherine died, we had a fight, terrible one. She wanted to step back from the company, spend more time on her art. I was less than supportive. Sarah propped herself up on an elbow, watching his face carefully. What happened? I told her the company needed her, that her art was just a hobby. James closed his eyes, the memory still painful. She said I'd forgotten how to see beauty in anything that couldn't be measured in profit margins. The next morning, before we could resolve things, she had the aneurysm. Just gone. And those were the last words we ever spoke to each other. Sarah pulled him close, offering silent comfort. After a moment, James continued, his voice rough with emotion. That's why I buried myself in work after she died. It wasn't just grief, it was guilt. I kept thinking if I'd been more understanding, if I'd supported her dreams, maybe she would have had more time to pursue what she really loved before. James, Sarah said softly, You can't blame yourself for Catherine's death. An aneurysm isn't something you could have prevented. I know that. Logically, I know. But feelings aren't logical, are they? He turned to look at her. What about you? What have you never told anyone? Sarah was quiet for so long that James thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. The night Peter died, I knew he shouldn't have been driving. He'd been working insane hours, barely sleeping. I could see how exhausted he was, but he insisted on going to check on a client's emergency. She swallowed hard. I could have stopped him. Should have hidden the car keys, called him a cab, something. But I didn't want to argue. I was tired too, tired of always being the responsible one, always worrying about him. So I let him go. James held her tighter as she continued. The police said he fell asleep at the wheel. The car went straight into a concrete barrier. They told me he died instantly, but I've always wondered. In those last moments, did he blame me for not stopping him? Oh, my love, James murmured into her hair. He wouldn't have blamed you. You know that, do I? Sarah's voice cracked. Sometimes I think that's why I agreed to our arrangement so easily. Not just because of the financial security, but because I felt like I deserved to be in a loveless marriage. Like it was my punishment. James shifted to look at her directly. Sarah, listen to me. You are not responsible for Peter's death, any more than I'm responsible for Catherine's. We've both been carrying these burdens of guilt for too long. Their conversation was interrupted by James's phone buzzing insistently. It was Margaret. James, his sister's voice was tense. Have you seen the Sunday Times? Minutes later, they were staring at the newspaper spread out on the kitchen counter. The headline read, Sterling Group CEO's young wife, the truth behind the marriage of convenience. The article was a hatchet job, clearly fed by someone with insider knowledge. It detailed their initial arrangement, complete with quotes from anonymous sources about the financial terms. But worse, it implied that Sarah had somehow engineered Peter's death for the insurance money, then manipulated her way into marriage with James. Richard Preston, James growled. This has his fingerprints all over it. Sarah sat heavily in a kitchen chair, her face pale. They're making me sound like some kind of black widow. James, this could destroy everything. The literacy center, your reputation, the company. James was already on the phone. Helen, get me Jerry in legal, and find out who at the Times wrote this piece. Also, call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. He turned to Sarah. We're going to fight this. But Sarah was staring at her own phone, her hands shaking. It's already spreading online. People are. They're saying horrible things. About me, about Peter. The next few days were a blur of damage control. James's legal team worked to contain the story, threatening lawsuits against anyone who repeated the more defamatory claims. The Literacy Center's board called an emergency meeting to discuss Sarah's continued involvement. Even Margaret was besieged with calls from society friends seeking gossip. Through it all, Sarah maintained a dignified silence in public, but James could see the toll it was taking on her. She barely slept, barely ate. The confident woman who had faced down the board was replaced by someone who jumped at every phone notification, who checked over her shoulder whenever they went out. The breaking point came when someone leaked Peter's autopsy photos online. Sarah found them while checking her email, the graphic images accompanied by cruel speculation about her involvement in his death. James found her in their bathroom, violently ill, her body shaking with sobs. I can't, she gasped between heaves. I can't do this anymore. They're destroying everything, Peter's memory, our life together, everything. James held her, his heart breaking as she fell apart in his arms. We'll leave, he said suddenly. Take an extended vacation. Let the lawyers handle this while we're gone. Sarah shook her head. Running away will just make us look guilty. And what about the company? The company can survive without me for a few weeks. You're more important. But before they could make any decisions, James's phone rang. It was Helen. Sir, she said, her voice urgent. You need to come to the office immediately. Someone's trying to call an emergency shareholder vote to remove you as CEO. James felt ice in his veins. Richard. Yes, sir. He's claiming your judgment is compromised, that the scandal is damaging shareholder value. He's got support from some of the smaller shareholders. After he hung up, James turned to find Sarah watching him with an expression he couldn't read. This is my fault, she said quietly. Everything you've built is at risk because of me. No, James said firmly. This is Richard Preston's fault. He's been waiting for an opportunity like this for years, but he's using me to do it. Using my past, my marriage to Peter. Sarah straightened suddenly, her eyes hardening with determination. I need to end this. Sarah, I need to face him directly. No more hiding, no more letting the lawyers handle it. It's time to show Richard Preston exactly who he's dealing with. The next morning, Sarah walked into Sterling Group's offices for the first time since the scandal broke. Heads turned as she made her way to the conference room where the emergency board meeting was about to begin. Richard Preston was already there, looking smug as he arranged papers in front of him. His smile faltered when he saw Sarah. Mrs. Sterling, he said coldly, this is a closed meeting. Actually, Sarah replied, her voice steady, as James's wife and a Sterling Group shareholder. I have every right to be here. She turned to address the whole room. And I have something to say before you vote. We don't need to hear more denials, Richard started, but Sarah cut him off. What you need to hear is the truth, the whole truth, not the twisted version you've been spreading. She pulled out a folder of her own. I have here signed affidavits from Peter's doctors about his medical condition before the accident. I have statements from witnesses who saw how exhausted he was that night. And I have proof that you, Mr. Preston, tried to pressure Peter into falsifying reports just weeks before his death. Richard's face went pale. That's a lie, is it? Peter kept detailed records, Mr. Preston. He was young and naive, but he wasn't stupid. He documented every irregular request you made, every time you pushed him to bend the rules. He just never got the chance to do anything with that information. Sarah's voice hardened. But I did. She began distributing copies of documents to the board members. You see, while you were so busy trying to destroy me, you forgot one important thing. I loved Peter Mitchell with all my heart. And after he died, I made it my mission to understand exactly what had been happening at Sterling Group that had him so worried in those final weeks. The board members were muttering now, flipping through the papers with growing concern. Mrs. Sterling, one of them spoke up. Are you saying Mr. Preston was involved in illegal activities? Not exactly illegal, Sarah replied. Just extremely unethical. The kind of behavior that, if it became public, would raise serious questions about his fitness to serve on this board. Richard stood up, his face mottled with rage. This is blackmail. No, Mr. Preston. This is justice. You tried to destroy my reputation, to tarnish Peter's memory, all to gain control of this company. But you underestimated me. You thought I was just a young widow who got lucky with a wealthy second husband. You forgot that I spent years watching Peter work in corporate finance. I learned how men like you operate. She turned to the board. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. Investigate these allegations. But know this, if you vote to remove James as CEO, these documents will find their way to the SEC and every major financial publication in the country. The room erupted in chaos. James, who had been watching silently from the doorway, felt a surge of pride and love for his wife. She had just outmaneuvered one of the shrewdest businessmen he knew, and she'd done it to protect him. The aftermath of Sarah's confrontation with Richard Preston reshaped Sterling Group in ways no one could have predicted. Within days, Richard resigned from the board to pursue other opportunities, though the whispers in financial circles told a different story. The attempted coup against James had failed spectacularly, and in its wake, a new era began. But for James and Sarah, the real transformation was happening behind closed doors. One evening, about a month after the showdown in the boardroom, James came home to find Sarah in Catherine's old art studio, which had remained untouched since her death. The room had gathered dust over the years, the canvases and brushes becoming silent monuments to what was lost. "I hope you don't mind," Sarah said softly, running her fingers along an empty easel. "I was thinking, maybe it's time to bring life back to this room." James stood in the doorway, memories washing over him. Catherine always said this room had the best light in the whole penthouse. She was right. Sarah moved to the large windows overlooking Central Park. "It's perfect for an art therapy program. We could partner with the Literacy Center, offer classes to underprivileged kids, maybe even adult workshops for people dealing with grief and trauma." James looked at her in amazement. Even after everything she'd been through, Sarah's first thought was how to help others. Moving to stand behind her, he wrapped his arms around her waist. "Catherine would have loved that idea," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And she would have loved you." Sarah leaned back against him. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing right by them, Peter and Catherine, being this happy together." "I used to wonder that too," James admitted. "But I've realized something. Love isn't a finite resource. Loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for Catherine, just like your love for me doesn't erase what you had with Peter." Sarah turned in his arms, her eyes glistening. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," he smiled, kissing her softly. "A young widow who showed me that the heart is capable of healing without forgetting." The transformation of Catherine's studio became their first true joint project. They hired art therapists, worked with child psychologists, and created a program that would honor both their late spouses while helping others heal from loss. The Catherine Sterling Mitchell Art Therapy Center opened 6 months later. On opening day, as children's laughter filled the once silent studio, Margaret found James watching Sarah help a young girl with her painting. "You know," Margaret said, linking her arm through her brother's, "when I suggested this marriage, I never imagined it would turn out like this." James chuckled. "You mean you didn't plan for me to fall madly in love with her?" "Oh, I hoped you might," Margaret admitted. "But this," she gestured to the room full of life and color, "this is beyond anything I could have dreamed." Their conversation was interrupted by Helen, who approached with an urgent expression. "Mr. Sterling, there's something you need to see." She handed him a tablet open to a financial news website. The headline made his blood run cold. "Former Sterling Group board member found dead. Richard Preston had apparently taken his own life, leaving behind a detailed confession of years of financial misconduct." The note specifically mentioned his attempt to destroy Sarah's reputation, expressing remorse for trying to tarnish the memory of Peter Mitchell. James looked up to find Sarah standing before him, having noticed his distress. Without a word, he showed her the tablet. "I never wanted this," she whispered, her face pale. "I just wanted him to leave us alone." James pulled her close. "This isn't your fault. Richard made his own choices, long before you came into the picture." That night, lying in bed, Sarah voiced what had been bothering her. "Do you think we're cursed, James? It seems like death follows us everywhere." James propped himself up on an elbow, looking at her seriously. "No, my love, I think we're blessed. We've both experienced profound loss, yes, but that loss led us to each other. And look what we've created from that pain, a center that will help countless others heal." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I have something to tell you," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been waiting for the right moment." James felt his heart skip a beat. "Sarah?" She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." The world seemed to stop. James stared at her, unable to form words. "I know it wasn't part of our arrangement," Sarah continued nervously. "And I know it might be complicated with our history." James silenced her with a kiss, pouring all his joy and love into it. When they finally broke apart, both were crying. "Complicated is what we do best," he said, wiping away her tears. "This baby is a gift, Sarah, a symbol of everything we've built together." The news of Sarah's pregnancy spread quickly through their circle. Margaret was ecstatic at the prospect of becoming an aunt. The Sterling Group board, now firmly supportive of their CEO and his wife, sent elaborate congratulations. Even the society pages, which had been so cruel during the scandal, celebrated the upcoming addition to the Sterling family. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed, they decided to make changes to the penthouse. The room next to their bedroom, which had remained empty since James moved in years ago, would become the nursery. While clearing it out, Sarah found a box of Catherine's journals. "James," she called, holding them carefully. "I think you should see these." That night, they sat together in bed, reading Catherine's words. In her final journal entries, she wrote about wanting to step back from the company not just for her art, but because she suspected she might be pregnant. She had planned to tell James the night of their fight. James closed the journal, his hands shaking. Sarah held him as he grieved anew for what might have been. "She wanted you to be a father so badly," Sarah said softly. "And you will be, my love. You'll be an amazing father." As her due date approached, they transformed Catherine's old bedroom into a beautiful nursery. Sarah insisted on incorporating elements that honored both Catherine and Peter. A painting Catherine had done of Central Park hanging above the crib, a handmade blanket that had belonged to Peter as a child draped over the rocking chair. "Our child will know about them," Sarah declared. "Will know how love can bridge past and present, how family isn't limited by time or death." When Sarah went into labor, it was Margaret who drove them to the hospital, as James was too nervous to handle the car. For 18 hours, he held Sarah's hand, whispering words of encouragement and love as she brought their child into the world. Finally, in the early hours of a spring morning, their daughter was born. They named her Catherine Rose Sterling, Catherine for James's first love, and Rose for Peter's mother. As James held his daughter for the first time, looking down at her perfect tiny face, he felt a sense of completion he had never known was possible. Sarah watched them from the hospital bed, exhausted but radiant. "Look what we made," she whispered. "Look what love made possible." James carried the baby to Sarah, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. As their daughter gripped his finger with her tiny hand, he marveled at the journey that had brought them here. What had started as a business arrangement, a marriage of convenience, had transformed into something profound and beautiful. "I love you," he said to Sarah, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you, more than I ever thought possible." Sarah smiled, tears in her eyes. "We love you too. All of us, past and present, here and gone. We're all part of this love story." As the sun rose over Manhattan, painting the hospital room in soft golden light, James Sterling held his family close. He thought about the twists and turns of fate that had brought him here, the loss of Catherine, the arranged marriage to Sarah, the challenges they'd faced together. What had begun as a price to be paid had become a priceless gift. Their daughter yawned, her tiny face scrunching up in an expression that somehow reminded him of both Catherine and Peter. Perhaps they were watching, he thought, smiling down on this new life that had sprung from loss and love. "Welcome to our complicated, beautiful family, little one," he whispered. And in that moment, as his daughter slept peacefully in her mother's arms, James knew that some things in life couldn't be arranged or calculated or bought. Some things, like love, simply grew in their own time, turning business arrangements into bonds of the heart and transforming loss into new beginnings. It wasn't the end of their story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. There would be more challenges ahead, more moments of joy and sorrow, more memories to create and honor. But they would face it all together, their love strengthened by the ghosts of the past and the promise of the future. As the morning light filled the room, James Sterling finally understood what both Catherine and Peter had known all along, that true love wasn't about perfection or convenience or arrangements. It was about finding someone who made you want to be better, who helped you heal, who showed you that the heart was capable of more love than you ever imagined possible. And in Sarah and their daughter, he had found exactly that. If this story has touched your heart and you want to keep discovering more moments of transformation and deep emotions, subscribe to the channel and join our community. Don't forget to leave a comment, give us a like if you enjoyed it, and most importantly, join us for the next video. Each story is a doorway to a new perspective, and together, we're creating a space to reflect and connect with experiences that truly matter.